Hello and welcome to our Conversation Club. We have as our guest this evening, Christopher Newell. Christopher or Chris, how would you like me to call you this evening? We know each other.
Chris is easy enough, yeah.
Very good, Chris, thank you. And my name is Andy Versosa, Director of Stanley-Whitman House. Our guest is Christopher Newell. I'm going to read a little bit about his bio, but before we get going, I'm going to read our museum's land acknowledgement. We at Stanley-Whitman House acknowledge that we are situated in the homeland of the Tungus people, who later invited the Mohegan, Wangunk, Quinnipiac, and other displaced Native people to join them here. Today, 5 nations, the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shaktacook, and Golden Hill Pagusset, and the descendants of other Native peoples continue to serve as stewards of this land. With this acknowledgement, we recognize the legacies of settler colonialism, and we signal ongoing commitment to building relationships with the indigenous communities who have lived on these ancestral lands almost 15,000 years into the future nations. So Stanley-Whitman House is on the land of the Tungus, which we know as Farmington, Connecticut. Stanley-Whitman House is a National Historic Landmark. It's a museum and living history center that collects, preserves, and interprets the history and culture of 17th and 19th century Farmington, Connecticut. Since 1935, it has operated under the auspices of the Farmington Village Green and Library Association, which is a nonprofit 501c3 educational organization. Our program tonight is called the Conversation Club. It endeavors to make new ideas and perspectives accessible. Re-examining the past frames meaningful dialogue, learning, and reflection, and helps us envision the future. Our club is based on the Conversation Club, originally formed in 1818, which gathered to discuss the leading issues of the day in Farmington, Connecticut. Our guest this evening, Chris Newell, Passamaquoddy, is a co-founder and director of education for Agamat Educational Initiative, a majority Native-owned educational consultancy based in Connecticut. He was born and raised in Passamaquoddy, Indian Township, Maine, and a proud citizen of the Passamaquoddy Tribe at Indian Township. From 2020 to 2021, Chris served as the first Wampanoag Executive Director for the Abbey Museum, Maine's only Smithsonian affiliate. Chris is going to talk to us about his book, If You Lived During the Plymouth Thanksgiving. And what I'm going to do is let him tell you a little bit about his book when he's speaking. And I just wanted to offer up a review that was written about the book and quote, verdict, this essential book should replace many established titles on the shelves. It never shies away from pitting hard history against a mythology that is not helpful to students living in the 21st century. This was a review by John Scott of the Baltimore County, and this was on September 1st, 2021. So without further ado, Chris, hello, thank you for being here this evening.
Hi, Andy, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. For this evening, I'd like you to talk about the genesis of this scholastic book. I think you talked about writing this perhaps during the pandemic, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you know, the genesis of the book really goes back years. I've been working with this material for a long time. I was formerly the education supervisor for the Pequot Museum. My wife is Mashantucket Pequot. I live in Mashantucket. My children are enrolled Mashantucket Pequot as well. And so I began working at the Pequot Museum back in 2014, quickly kind of rose up to become the education supervisor. Because as I got back into education, I really found that museum education was kind of my niche, you know, where I really kind of enjoyed the world of education, especially working in a tribal museum. The Pequot history, you know, is the first war of aggression by the English in what is now called New England, you know, and an attempt at a genocide, you know, that continued, you know, through hundreds of years, but began back with the Pequot War in 1636. And I began, you know, as a parent of Pequot children, I have a vested interest in making sure that, the history of, my children gets taught right. And working at the Pequot Museum, one of the things, moving from Maine, from Wabanaki territory down into Connecticut and Massachusetts area, one of the things I noticed pretty much right away was the complete erasure of Native peoples from the landscape, especially the historical landscape. I mean, you can go into Connecticut, any historical marker you see in a town, this town founded by this person, who bought it, land from this sachem at this time, and that's the history of how towns get created. And that's the best you get, when it comes to, it's just, writing about natives as if or Native people in Connecticut only exist in the past. There's 5 tribes that still exist in the state of Connecticut. 2 are federally recognized, 3 are state recognized. And in Connecticut, state recognition goes back all the way to the 1600s. So this is, the state recognized tribes have definitely been around, for quite a while, and have survived, the elements of genocide. And at the Pequot Museum, oftentimes we would get asked about the Thanksgiving holiday. It's not Pequot history, but it does sometimes get conflated a little bit with Pequot history, with a day of Thanksgiving that's associated with the Pequot massacre of 1637. But that's really separate from the Wampanoag history and the landing of the Mayflower. But still, because we're in the region, we would get asked about it a lot. And I've gotten to know Wampanoag friends ever since I was, a teenager. My first.
I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, how a Passamaquoddy would be writing about a Wampanoag story. So
exactly. Yeah.
I'm glad you're winding into this.
Yeah, I would love to, get into that, because, this is not Passamaquoddy history. So, how did I end up there? I met first Wampanoag friends way back as a teenager in summer programs. Fawn Brown was a friend, Woody Vanderhoop, and among others. Got to know the families in Aquina, and got to know people at Mashpee. And over the years, I've watched them teach their own history about, teach their own version about this history, and and oftentimes seeing the frustration at what gets left out, right? And the Wampanoag people look at the Thanksgiving holiday much different than many other Native cultures or communities. And they actually, since 1971, Frank James Wamsutta, a Wampanoag historian, created something called the National Day of Mourning, which was actually something both my parents attended. My father was attending Harvard University at the time in 1971, and actually was at the first National Day of Mourning that the Wampanoags put on. So I've always had, a close connection with the people in this region, but I also understand that I am a visitor, to this region. And so I treat the histories of, the peoples in this region with that mindset that I'm a guest in their homelands. And so therefore, as a father of Pequot children, I want to make sure that histories in the region are being taught correctly, and really to counteract the erasure that has been going on. Now, Wampanoag people have been working at this, like crazy. That's where a lot of the material that I sourced the book for the book came from, was really on watching Wampanoag people teach about their own history, especially about the Thanksgiving holiday. And during my time at the Pequot Museum, the question of the holiday would come up, especially this month, right? That we would get asked about it so much. I created a educational classroom enrichment program called Demystifying Thanksgiving, where I really started to look into how the Thanksgiving holiday actually got created, beyond the narrative of the first Thanksgiving and the Mayflower landing, but how did the actual Thanksgiving holiday get created? And through that, I started to discover the stories of Sarah Josepha Hale in the 19th century, and how, she kind of tied the Pilgrim forefathers story together, with the narrative, and how she really pushed for the creation of a Thanksgiving holiday. And I was really interested and began to get more intrigued. So I spent, a couple of years working with this material. Then at the museum, we also developed an event that we, would occur in November that we called Feast. Which is, in response to some of the Demystifying Thanksgiving material, because one of the things that we realized was in 1600s, a day of Thanksgiving to the English was a day of prayer and fasting, not feasting. Thanksgiving holiday feasts, as we have today, are actually more resemblant of native, Thanksgiving feasts, which were happening throughout the lunar cycle, in the region. And so we had this event, as a way to kind of bring that idea back to people, that a Thanksgiving feast actually is more resemblant of native traditions. So we would have this food event, and Sherry Pocknet, Wampanoag chef, designed the entire menu. All the food was Indigenous inspired. No pork, beef, or chicken on the menu, because cows, pigs, and chickens don't arrive till Europeans come. So, it was fish, it was venison, it was duck, corn, beans, squash. That was what we were feeding to our guests. And then I would also do an educational, presentation. I would change the material a little bit every year to give people either some more history from the Wampanoag perspective on the Mayflower landing, or history on how the Thanksgiving holiday was created in the 19th century, to try to broaden people's understanding of the holiday. And really try to work at, digging into where the narrative kind of got put in, and why it exists. Because for me as a Native person, we celebrate in my family's house, we do celebrate the holiday, the Thanksgiving holiday, but we have never celebrated it in conjunction with the idea of a founding myth. Because the idea that somebody founded our country when we have existed here 12,000 plus years, only a couple of hundred years ago, never really fit with a Passamaquoddy family, So this is something I've always been interested in. When I got down to Southern New England Territory, I really wanted to work at telling the histories of the people in the region correctly. And my goal, literally, as this project came about and Scholastic approached me to write this particular book, was not to create a book necessarily that would get, the starred reviews that, one of which you just read from, I really wanted to create a resource that Wampanoag people would be, willing to put forward and say, this is a great resource to learn about in book form, right? And then hopefully as an entryway, to get from my book, a Passamaquoddy written book, into Wampanoag written material, right? Which will then get into the details of their culture, and will center them in their own stories. So that's kind of how the generation and the attitude of how this all came together.
Sure. I want to have you focus a little bit and share a little bit about centering. I also want to have this opportunity to have folks that are on the Zoom, if they want to put questions or comments in the chat, they're welcome to do that. Both Chris and I are looking at the chat. Periodically, we'll glance at that. I do want to hold the book up. I don't know how well folks can see the cover, but this is the soft cover version of the Scholastic book that Chris wrote. But if you could, Chris, talk a little bit about centering the Wampanoag story, and particularly from your vantage point of being from another tribe.
Yeah. So once again, I would watch Wampanoag friends, people I consider relatives. They're not blood relatives, but people I consider relatives. I've known them 20 plus years now. I would see them, they're constantly in November, that they get overrun with requests to come in the classrooms, and so they're working at telling this history, and they're really talking about the effect of colonization on Wampanoag peoples, and how that's affected the modern day communities, and that's a thing that I really pulled from how they were teaching about themselves, is that they were really trying to counteract the narrative that Wampanoag people were all gone, right? And this would happen at the Pequot Museum too. The erasure so complete that people just asking, do Pequot still live, right? So they're really working to counteract that and put Wampanoag people into the present, right? That they exist here, that they, definitely have, worked as part of the creation of how America began to be America, and also contribute to the modern day America, as well as the area that we now know as Eastern Massachusetts. So that was really, the impetus behind my energy is really watching how they spoke about their own history associating with the Mayflower landing. And they would bring up, oftentimes not just the feast, which is so centered in the first Thanksgiving narrative, that, that 3-day feast, which actually the English didn't write much about, but it became such the lionized story. They talk about the effects of the epidemic that happened before the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth, or
Some
Patuxet.
people may not know about how many people perished.
Exactly.
Do
Yeah,
you
and they would
want to
talk about
share?
the effects of afterwards of the effects of war and decimation and dispossession of land. And I wanted to make sure that in this particular retelling that those perspectives were being included, that we were being real about how this history has affected different populations, especially the Wampanoag people.
Well, we do have a very basic, simple question. People want to know how they could buy a book. I know that it's probably back ordered now, but maybe you could share a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, it's pretty amazing to me. I was somebody was asking me where can I find it, and I was wondering why they were having an issue, and I looked it up, and several websites actually have it out of stock right now. I know Amazon still is selling copies; they still have it in stock. But one of the places I tend to point people to is a website called IndieBound, INDIE Bound. If you go there and search for the book, it will give you local bookstores that have it in stock. These are sometimes, independent mom and pop stores. They might not have a website, so you can't order it. You would have to actually go to the store and buy it. But if you want to support the little guy, that's one way to do it, is through the IndieBound site. And you can hopefully find it in your local area.
How new is this book to bookshelves?
It was released on November 2nd of this year. So we're talking just a little over 2 weeks it's been out.
Right. So thank you for that. So you're getting a lot of comments from folks. I'm not sure if you're getting a chance to glance through the chat, but if you feel free, of course, to read through that. But there's one comment here from Emily Keniston to you, Chris. I'm the parent of 4 white kids in Maine and would really like to deconstruct the myths that have been absorbed by many of us. Other than your book, what are some first steps to doing this? I'm intrigued by the idea of sharing recipes at our feast that represent the Wampanoag.
Let's see. So yeah, so deconstructing myths. That's one of the things that Eggemount Educational Initiative was actually kind of created to do. Put Native perspectives back into the histories that we're teaching in all areas of education, whether K through 12, colleges, universities, museums, which is our forte, but also media as well. And if you think about it for a second, I'll describe the typical public school experience with Native content for many Americans. It basically has 3 touch points. Your particular experience may have more than that, depending on your school or your teachers, right? But typically, there's 3 touch points for the average American in Native content. And this has been going on since the 19th century. Exploration, European explorations, right? Columbus, other explorers encountering Native peoples, and kind of the time clock for history in this country in the school system starts with Europeans arriving. Which is something that we try to reset. Then the next touch point is the first Thanksgiving narrative, which came about in the 19th century. And there's some reasons behind why it emerged, but it's been taught as fact, ever since. And was actually created, partially by fiction writers with just a bit of truth, based on a bit of truth, but fiction writers kind of expanding on it. And then we don't hear about Native content again until we get to 19th century American westward expansion. And we're talking about Plains Indian Wars, we're talking about, Indian removal era, Trail of Tears, those stories start to come out of that. But what's happening on the East Coast here, right? A lot of tribes are impacted by colonization, yet are surviving. right? You know, they have dealt with decimation of disease, the violence of warfare, the creation of reservations, and you know, being dispossessed of land, yet are somehow still surviving and in some ways thriving in the economies that got created around. Right. And so, you know, where did that story go? Right. And so the problem with that is that so many people lose focus on Eastern Coast tribes. It leads to a bias about East Coast tribes. I can remember when I got to Dartmouth back in the 90s, even people from other tribes, this is before the internet, by the way, so it's not before the age of what we call the age of information, right? So even people from Western tribes had never heard of Passamaquoddy people, right? Just never heard of us. Didn't think that you know, East Coast tribes could even speak our languages or things of that sort anymore. You know, and that was an issue, right? So I'm just looking at the way the public school system, you know, has kind of constructed a master narrative about itself, about how America got created, and tells a story about how great it, you know, America is. And there are some, you know, things that are pretty interesting, you know, and what some people might call progress, you know, but a lot of what we call development and improvement, which are English language terms for basically destroying nature and putting something on top of it, you know, are actually sometimes from a different perspective, can be viewed from kind of a 360 or a 180 view. You know, it actually see that development as actually a destruction. You know, so moving through the historical timeline, I just wanted to see histories represented that would be more inclusive of Native perspectives all the way through, because Native peoples, especially here in the East, have been involved with all parts of history. Every major war from the American Revolution onward, Wampanoag people especially, you know, helping out the Americans in the Revolutionary War, World War I, World War II, the Industrial Revolution. You know, there's so many ways to incorporate living Native communities back into the histories of America. And that's really what we're working at doing. And so, yeah, deconstructing the myths. If you hear erasure stories, right, you know, the last of, you know, that's something that media started doing way back in the 1700s. The last of this tribe has died, yet then a month later in another newspaper, the last of the same tribe has died. You know, that's like, if you see these erasure narratives popping up, right, question them. You know, where did they come from? Look at the English language words that we use to sometimes describe encounters between Euro-American culture and Native peoples, right? Frontier, and when we talk about American westward expansion, whose word is that, right? A front of what, right? There's 15 million people living on the other side of that so-called frontier. So is it a front of something, or is it a line of demarcation, right? You know, between actually, you know, was viewed as progress on one side of it, but was actually viewed as a level of destruction approaching if you're on the other side of it. So let's start to deconstruct the English language words that we use to sometimes describe history, and especially when it comes to Native people, and how, you know, even things like generalized terminology like Native American and American Indian, those are conceptualized in Europe. Our languages don't have words for that. You know, we don't describe, label people that way. We describe, you know, different tribes by how we relate to one another or how those people relate to their geography. But we do not describe ourselves, you know, through these the English language labels that we see today. So generalized terms like Native American, American Indian began, you know, in the English language as Indians, savages, right? And those terms began way over in Europe. The idea of singularizing all 1,000+ different cultures under one umbrella term began in Europe. What does that do when we speak in this foreign language of English and we try to talk about indigenous cultures? We have to now go through this layer, right? And then start to dig down into, okay, I am not a Native American, American Indian Native. I am Passamaquoddy. I'm Passamaquoddy. I'm people of Spirit Pollock, which is different than Wampanoag people, right? The people of the first light. which is different from Dakota people and Cree people and Ojibwe people. And so we start to complicate the histories and the cultures, pluralize. That's another way to deconstruct the way we talk about Native people. If you hear English language say the American or the Indian or the Native culture, right? The Native American culture. There's 574 recognized tribes right now. Pluralize it. Right? Those are all methods that you can use to deconstruct some of the ways that we talk about Native peoples, especially in history or in contemporary issues of today.
So Chris, I'm going to do a little technical thing here, which I could have done before. This speaks to my inexperience here. So I just made you just the speaker view and minimize my view. So this is a good opportunity to read something from Jim Carter that possibly you could speak to. He says, I appreciate your idea of the feast versus the fast as a way to think of our modern Thanksgiving holiday being more indigenous than European. Can you also speak to the idea of giving thanks and gratitude, possibly also being a point of comparison between the cultures also?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of talk about that in the book. I break down the English language word Thanksgiving, and I break it down through the etymology of Old English. And this was actually, me and Scholastic kind of went back and forth because I was, they were feeling I was defining the word. So they would cross out my explanation, my etymological, explanation of how the word came about, and they would replace it with the Merriam-Webster definition, right? The accepted, 2021 definition of, of the word. And what I did was I looked, tunk skifen, to bestow a grateful thought, right? That's the etymology from Old English of what that word actually means, right? So if we think about that for a second, the idea of, engaging in an action to bestow grateful thoughts upon one another is something that exists across all cultures. So there are different ways of cultures across the world take part in events that bestow grateful thoughts, essentially English language Thanksgivings, right? And so if we think about it that way, we can kind of broaden it once again beyond that one single feast event that happened in 1621 that happened just in, and try to make it just an American thing and try to think beyond that people give thanks, in various ways, oftentimes with feasts and food in different cultures all around the country. And that's one of the latter questions in the book is, do other cultures celebrate Thanksgivings, and how do they do that? Oh, you're on mute, Andy.
I wish I was a teenager. I'd be really up with all this technology here. What I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is curriculum. Now, you've worked in a museum setting at the Mashantucket Pequot, and you were at the Abbey Museum. And what I wanted to ask you is that there's an opportunity with the state of Connecticut now with a mandate of teaching Indigenous curriculum in 2022. I know there's a few teachers on the chat, on the Zoom here. Could you speak a little bit about that and how something like your book plays into that, particularly with a publisher like Scholastic?
Sure, absolutely.
I was just going to say, I'm certain this isn't going to be your only book, right?
No, actually it won't be. This was my first book, and I wasn't considering myself a writer, but I'm now a published author. Scholastic was happy enough with the effort that they've actually called me back for another one. So yeah, I will be writing another in the If You Lived series, upcoming in the next year. So when it comes to the curriculum question, I come from the state of Maine. Way back in 2001. State of Maine is actually one of the first states. I think it was the first state that actually required studying the Native people from the region. It was the Wabanaki Studies mandate called LD 291. Now, so it's about, not studying native peoples. It's about studying Wampanoag peoples, which are, from, the state of Maine is inside a larger domain of homelands, which we call the Dawn Land, which is where Wampanoag, the anglicized version of our name for ourselves, comes from, the people of the Dawn. So, it's a great mandate in that it's very, very it's very succinct. It gets straight to the point of not going after generalized terms. It's talking about, the actual indigenous people from the territory that is now called the state of Maine. So the problem with it, though, is that it was basically kind of unfunded. It took 20 years before it really started to gain traction and started to get fully implemented. Portland Public Schools, the largest public school district in the state of Maine, just this year, finally fully implemented LD 291 all the way from K through 12 throughout the entire school district. So now that offers basically a better pathway for other non-native school districts to really adopt it. So we've learned some lessons from that. Now, Connecticut has been passing several laws, to do with education, one of which was the Holocaust and Genocide Studies mandate. Right there, that kind of opened the door for Native studies in the state of Connecticut, because the Pequot War is definitely, a study of genocide. So if you're going to, the Holocaust is one part of that law that has to be studied. The other one is genocide studies. And that was open enough that it could be any genocide that you wanted to, look at. And if you want to look at the history of the state of Connecticut, the Pequot War is a great touch point, for incorporating that. So that was one law that actually opened the door, but not everybody followed, that path. And so this last summer, Kathy Austin worked with Rodney Butler and some other tribal leaders in the state of Connecticut, and they passed a similar mandate now for Native studies to be included in the state of Connecticut. And it'll follow much the same path as the Holocaust and Genocide Studies mandate. In that, there is, one of the things that I wish the state had done was funded the process of getting this done, which they haven't done. But we at Agama Educational Initiative are going to work with the tribes and with the state Department of Education, as well as other Native scholars in the region here, to first come up with the standards. What are the benchmarks that teachers should be trying to, achieve to teach about the 5 tribes that are here and the 22 historical tribes. And you mentioned them in your land acknowledgement, the Tungus and others that left with the Brothertown movement, and talking about that history. What are the benchmarks, right? Through K through 12 that, people should be learning about, and then, fill in where we source the information from, and really start working with the tribes to start creation of sourcing of information from the tribes and tribal communities themselves. In the state of Maine, when LD 291 was passed, many of the tribes in the state did work to create their own materials. So schools do have the resources to go to tribal websites and get the materials to learn to adopt LD 291. There just hasn't been a lot of motivation to do so. But what I've seen in the state of Connecticut in my time here is that educators really, really want to do better. When I was at the Pequot Museum, teachers were taking notes on my tours as we were going through, and they were creating curriculums and homework and other things, even little hidden, hunts, for scavenger hunts for things in the museum to help them learn. So they really were looking for those materials, but a lot of them aren't produced yet, right? And so with this mandate, now we have some motivation for the communities, hopefully, to really start writing their own histories and telling their own stories so that we can center them in the creation of this mandate, because as I said, the teachers want to do better. They're just looking for the sources. And now with the motivation of the law, if I'm sure there's going to be some people that are be willing to help, try to fund it. We just got to get kind of creative in how we do that. But honestly, for me, it's not about money, right? Agama Educational Initiative, we're going to help with this no matter what, whether we get paid or not. because, you know, my business partner Adonis and I live here in the region. We're both visiting Native people. She's Diné, born in Arizona, Ojibwe, Chickasaw, Choctaw, married to Narragansett in Rhode Island. We're both guests here, but we both have vested interest in making sure that the region tells its history better, because we're raising children. We're raising Native children here in this area ourselves. You know, so we want to have better experiences for our children than we had in the public education system, especially even our experiences that we've had working in the Pequot Museum. We want to see those experiences improve for our children, but also for the children of the state of Connecticut, you know, because they actually appreciate learning about Native peoples when they actually, I mean, even though some of the history is hard, right? The Pequot War is a hard piece of history to talk about. It's real genocide, but third graders understand that they're not personally responsible for that history. What they end up learning from learning about it is that genocide's bad, number one, which is a good thing for children to learn. And as human beings, that's something that we shouldn't do to one another. And they also, at the end of it, learn about a living Pequot community. And they exit the museum actually more excited than when they entered, because their world now is not erased, has natives erased from it, but includes the Pequots, includes the Schaghticoke, includes the Mohegan, and it's really talking about how they're, contributing to what is now the state of Connecticut of today, right? And they get so much more excited about that. And so the effect is not just positive for Native people. Not only are they seen they get to reflect themselves in the history that gets taught in the public school system, but non-Native children are no longer getting taught the mythology of the first Thanksgiving narrative, which when they get to college age and they end up in a more diverse crowd and they start learning, you know, they end up confronting what they didn't learn in their younger public school days. And that causes moments of embarrassment, and occasionally moments where people get angry at each other because of a misstep that happened, just because of lack of knowledge, right? And those students didn't want that to happen to themselves. They didn't want to embarrass themselves, but yet they found themselves in that situation because of lack of knowledge. And I really would love to see a more informed world. And that's really where I'm coming from. You know, all I can do is just try to contribute as much as I can to adding knowledge to the world. I describe it in the book that the history of the Mayflower landing looks different depending on, your perspective, whether you're viewing the story from the boat or from the shore, right? That's a good, I borrow that from Gisatanamuk. I'm sure you know him as well, right? And we've used that in the Upstander Project materials for Dawnland and others about teaching about different perspectives, especially between colonists versus Native people, the view from the boat, view from the shore, very alternate views, right, of the same piece of history.
Chris, it's interesting with your book coming out, folks have pointed out or mentioned the misspelling, they think, of the title. I wanted to have you speak to that, if you would, and particularly since your book has been published, in your own interaction with those folks who think that it's misspelled.
Sure. It was interesting. Before the book came out, on Eggamot, I put a advertisement, especially after one of the starred reviews, just kind of promoting it, on our business's Facebook page. And people see the picture of it, and without reading the book, are commenting, how could Scholastic publish that book? They spelled Plymouth wrong. Nobody spelled check, like that. And it was just like, that was like, it was such a focal point of people when they would see the spelling. Now, where did I get the spelling? Well, I got the spelling from the way William Bradford, spelled Plymouth back in the 17th century in his recount of the time period of Plymouth Plantation. And so where did I get that from? Well, a lot of Wampanoag friends have worked for the Plymouth Patuxet Museum, which was formerly called Plymouth Plantation, right? And they use that spelling as well. And that's how I particularly learned about it. was the alternate spellings was actually through my encounters through the people that worked through that museum. And what I found out was a couple of things. Number one, it enforces one of the things that we teach at Agamouth, that English is a foreign language to this land, right? And that English back in the 17th century was not standardized. There were no, set dictionaries and things like that. There were no, set spelling rules. So people spelled sometimes phonetically. And if you just look at the US Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, you're going to find a whole lot of differently spelled words, right? You can still read them, you know what they're saying, but they're spelled differently now than they were back then. They're using phonetic spellings and things of that sort. Now, the story behind it, interestingly enough, is that there was a purpose to it. Bradford's people, when they named their plantation, wanted to name it in honor of their departure point in Plymouth, England, Plymouth, which is the modern day spelling of Plymouth, Massachusetts. So they did name their plantation Plymouth Plantation. However, they didn't want to confuse people into thinking that Plymouth Plantation was Plymouth, England. So on purpose, Bradford used multiple different spellings, Plimoth, Plimouth, as well as a few others. And so it was spelled differently, just to differentiate it from Plymouth, England, so people would not get them confused. But eventually, the adoption of the Plymouth became the standard for what became Plymouth, Massachusetts.
This is a technical question. I just got in the chat, someone seems to be having difficulty with their sound. So I just want to do a little check real quick. It might be that person's computer. So just to do a real quick check on that.
I apologize for that. I hope it's not on my end here. I'm not at home right now. I'm actually in Zibayag at my aunt's house, and I typically have great internet connection at my home, but doing things on the fly at the moment.
Okay, it looks like the sound is
good.
fine. Yeah.
Excellent.
Chris, would you mind speaking about where you are and how special it is right now?
Yeah, so I am home in my grandmother and my father's home community, Zibayag, which is known as Pleasant Point in the English language. Zibayag, Madakmiguk are the two Passamaquoddy communities in the state of Maine. And our communities of, we were thankfully not removed during the removal era. So we have been here for 12,000 years. So, I'm literally, at the mouth of Scudig, which is now known as the St. Croix River, which is now the border between the US and Canada. But I am literally on the lands that my ancestors have been for the last 12,000 years, and surrounded by Passamaquoddy people, living in Connecticut. I love Connecticut. There's a lot to love about it, but there's a lack of Passamaquoddy people, right? And so the people that I grew up around, the language that I grew up around, is all present here with me today, and especially family. And that's, I'm the only one in my blood family on the Passamaquoddy side of my family that lives outside of the two reservations here in the state of Maine. So being here is always special. It's hard to leave.
Absolutely. So we have had a request a couple times for you to possibly read something, a selection, a passage from your book, if you could, that you might think folks on the Zoom chat might enjoy. Is there something that you can think of? Or
Sure. Give me a second to look this up here. But there was something that there was a comment earlier. Somebody asked, so why did they invite the colonists to the feast? And that's actually, I'm going to work on that, by reading some of the book here, because the question actually needs a bit of a reframing, right? So the feast that we talk about, that people refer to often as the first Thanksgiving, is the 1621 feast. That actually did happen. What actually happened that day, though, right? It wasn't an invitation of Wampanoag people inviting the colonists in. It was actually a different story of how that happened. And let me find the question. And, oh, here we go. All right, page 69 is where I'm looking for. The question is number 22. What happened at the feast in Plymouth in 1621? So the way the book is broke down, just structurally, just so people know, this is written for 2nd to 4th graders, and essentially it's question and answer. So it's kind of like a chapter book, except the chapters are a question, and then the answer is the chapter, which is a few paragraphs at most, for the reading level. So this is question number 22. What happened at the feast in Plymouth in 1621? After a successful first harvest, the English colonists at Plymouth Plantation decided to celebrate with a feast. So it wasn't actually the Wampanoags inviting, it was actually the English deciding to have a feast. Now, as part of the celebration, the English colonists took part in recreation, eating, socializing, and firing their weapons. As the day went on, Passamaquoddy entered Plymouth with a group of 90 warriors. Following the terms of the alliance, now this is something that goes over earlier in the book, is that a peaceful alliance, a mutually beneficial alliance was made between Bradford's people and Passamaquoddy. And so they were living peacefully at this time. However, when you hear 90, the chief and 90 warriors, 90 men coming in, right? That doesn't necessarily, evoke friendliness at the beginning right there. And so you hear about them firing guns. Well, Passamaquoddy was wondering what's going on here. Is some fighting about to go on? Do we need to help? Do we need to fight? What's going? So he showed up with actually a fighting force, but he ended up discovering something different. So following the terms of the alliance, the Wampanoag men laid down their weapons before entering the plantation. Once inside the village, Passamaquoddy realized that there had not be enough food for everyone, as the Wampanoag had added 90 people to the celebration. He sent 4 men to kill 5 deer, which they gave to Governor Bradford and his people. This was a very meaningful gift, sharing whatever one has, contributing for the overall good of the community, and making sure everyone has enough to eat are strong traditional values that the Wampanoag people followed to ensure everyone's well-being. Not much is written about the feast itself. We do know the English hosted Passamaquoddy and his men for 3 days. There is no historical mention of turkey at this feast, although it could have been there. The English colonists and Passamaquoddy's men feasted on foods of the time, which included duck, deer, corn, beans, squash, dried berries, and seafood, amongst other foods.
And thank you. I'm going to quickly look through the chat and the comments. You do address, there's one comment here. The book is listed as being for ages 7 to 10. Do you have any suggestions as to how to adapt it or things to keep in mind when preparing lessons for preschool students?
Yeah, one of the things I would do is, you can read the book, and I think it would probably steer people away from the old habit that public schools would have during this time of year. And this is something that, you got to remember, 70% of Native people live off reservation. Our children are in public schools. And so when the first Thanksgiving narrative is reenacted, and kindergarteners or preschoolers are put in the paper headdresses and are given the paper bag vests with the fringe on them and stuff like that, and are dressing up as pilgrims and Indians and whatnot. They come home dressed like that to our houses. And as Native parents, we are oftentimes shocked that our kids were subjected, to that behavior, mimicking their a caricature of their culture in a way. And so that's one of the things that I would, have people in pre-K, kindergarten work against, is that reenactment portion, because once again, that's based off of a fictionalized, accounting, that got built out of that one paragraph description of the feast. when it comes to, what Thanksgiving is, we don't have to teach the narrative of the Mayflower to teach about the holiday, because what is Thanksgiving? Giving thanks, right? Bestowing grateful thoughts. How do we teach that to children? Right? It can be a feast. It can be sharing food, right? Culturally, that's one of the things every culture does, right? I can remember going to Paris a couple of years back to promote Dawnland, and I was invited to come to a professor's house, and she cooked for me. And, the best thing I could do was to eat her food, right? And enjoy, her hosting as a guest, and be very thankful for that. So those are sharing food is a way that cross cultures, right? That we can talk about giving thanks to one another, right? That all cultures can get around. That's one of the nicest things you can do. Is I love to cook myself. I love to see people enjoy stuff that I created for them. I have a personal inside feeling, and so I'll work hard at cooking something just to have that feeling of seeing people enjoy it. Right? So let's talk about that when we talk about Thanksgiving. What does that feeling really mean? What does it mean to give thanks? How do we actually express that in 2021? Right? And, we can talk about the Mayflower landing, but we don't have to talk about it in November. Right? We can talk about it at another time of the year. It doesn't have to happen during the Thanksgiving holiday.
Well, I do want to remind folks that if they have questions or comments, to please use the chat or the Q&A. And one of the things I wanted you to talk about that you just did earlier in the day today, you had mentioned before we started this evening about the podcast with Scholastic that you're going to be, that will air before Thanksgiving. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I'm sure people can look that up online.
Yeah, so the next available podcast, Scholastics Podcast, will be on If You Live During the Plymouth Thanksgiving, and it includes myself as well as my editor, Katie Height. We really kind of dig into some questions, one of which, a really interesting one, because sometimes one of the things I really go into is describing what a Thanksgiving is to English people versus to Native people. And, in the 17th century, in the 1600s, a day of Thanksgiving to the English people was often declared as a, for various reasons, as a way to get people to embrace their covenant with God. But there would be different reasons for it. And sometimes they would be declared for a victory in battle. So in 1637, after the Pequot Massacre, John Winthrop, who was the head of another Massachusetts colony, right? There was the Plymouth colony, and then later on was developed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. John Winthrop is, got a history of, working, founding cities like Boston, New London, Connecticut, stuff like that. He's got a lot of history in the area, and he's very well written about. But he did something that was, not a lot of people appreciate, definitely, because it's if you think about it, it's kind of a rough thought. He would declare that after the Pequot Massacre, after the May attack by John Mason with the English and their allies against the Pequot village in Mystic, burning the entire village, killing 600 men, women, and children in this first, attack of not just combatants, but non-combatants, just slash and burn everything type of strategy. John Winthrop would declare that for the next 100 years, this is what he wanted anyway, it didn't happen this way, but he would declare that for the next 100 years, that day in May would be a day of Thanksgiving in honor of the English victory over the Pequots. So this is really a calling for a day of prayer in honor of the killing, the massacre of 600 people, right? And so there are folks that see that history and oftentimes kind of conflate the two stories together. The Mayflower landing versus the 1637 declaration of a day of Thanksgiving. Sometimes we'll kind of equate the two with, a Thanksgiving with massacre, because sometimes an English day of Thanksgiving was declared for that reason. But I try to make clear that those are two separate histories. You know, the Pequot history, the English in the Connecticut colony, this is at 1637 versus 1620 to 1621 and Wampanoag people, and really try to make sure that people understand the differences between the two. But also not to erase the fact that the English did declare days of Thanksgiving, and sometimes in honor of horrific things.
Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the partnership that you had in putting together the book with your illustrator, Winona Nelson. Could you talk a little bit about that process and the significance of how she approached doing her artwork for the book?
Absolutely, yeah. So Winona Nelson is Leech Lake Ojibwe enrolled. She lives currently in the city of Philadelphia. This is the first picture book that she's ever done. She does a lot of fantasy art, so dragons and things like that. It's just amazing stuff that she does. She's very, very talented, but she's also very grounded in Ojibwe culture. She knows her history, knows her people, knows her culture very, very well. And Ojibwe culture are woodland peoples. They are different, but not totally different. Ojibwe peoples do speak a dialect of Algonquin. Wampanoag people speak a dialect of Algonquin. Passamaquoddy people speak a dialect of Algonquin. Algonquin is a language family. And so inside that family, there is a formation of the way the language is spoken that is familiar. So we sometimes share words with one another. In my language, we say moxon, say shoe. In Pequot, they say moxon, and then Ojibwe magazine. So it's pretty similar across the board in some respects and some words, right? So there's relationship, and so there's familiarity with it. And one of the things that she has also experienced is seeing Native illustration or illustration of Native histories, oftentimes by non-Native illustrators, right, depicting things from a non-Native perspective. And so she really, really worked at trying to undo that type of mode of creation of Native content. She did her homework, so she was given a layout. This is what we need pictures for these pieces of text, but she did her homework. Okay, she really went and looked, how do Wampanoag people dress in the time period? How did their hair look, right? And got that all correct. How did their weetus look, right? We know them as wigwams, and that's an Algonquin word. We say wigwam in Passamaquoddy, but they actually call their homes weetu down in Wampanoag territory. But they're similar in structure, but they have different bark than Ojibwe and Passamaquoddy people. We use birch bark, and they use the thick barks that are available down in the region in what we now call southern New England. So they look a little bit different. She researched that, how they make their fishing wares, right? None of these things she didn't ask me these questions. She didn't come to me and say, how do I do this? She figured it out herself and got it right in so many respects. There is one depiction of birch bark canoes kind of early in there, which Ojibwe people and Passamaquoddy people, we share that technology. The tribes in that region, did use birch bark canoes, but they didn't create them. They traded for them. Their primary canoes were dugout canoes. And then you do see dugout canoes depicted all the way through the rest of it. And, so she gets so much right in the depiction. And it's not like over romanticized or anything like that. It's just, and it's the color palette even, I just loved the beauty of how it all came about. Because some of the histories, once again, we talk about are kind of hard, right? How do we depict those things in a way that's respectful and, being correct? And I think because she's Ojibwe and once again has experienced Ojibwe stories being told by other non-Ojibwe people and getting it wrong, I think she really was invested in making sure, just as I was, that Wampanoag people would feel honored with these illustrations and would want them to use them themselves. I think she definitely had that same kind of motivation behind the level of work she put into it.
Thank you again. I'm going to read another comment, and it's a question as well. This is, were the Wampanoag ever in the area of West Hartford? There is a Wampanoag country club in West Hartford. assuming it was just a borrowed name or a reference to Metacomet, who was in the area during King Philip's War, how would the Wampanoag feel about the use of their name in this way?
Well, I mean, it's kind of like that. That's what New England, or at least Southern New England, does. You know, you see, like, even in cities like Fairfield, you know, areas called Sachem's Head or Pequot Country Club or things like that. That's not even Pequot territory out on that side of the state of Connecticut. But the Pequot War raged through there. So there's a piece of history that includes Pequots going through there, and that became the defining moment, you know, that these things get named after. This is another example of that. So I can imagine, I don't want to speak for Wampanoag people, but I can imagine as a Wampanoag to go into West Hartford, which is Tungus, you know, Connecticut River peoples, you know, which is totally different from the Wampanoag people of the First Light, totally different cultures. To see that is probably a little bit frustrating, right? You know, because they kind of understand how the name came about, and John really does a good job of kind of referencing that it's a, you know, a reference to Pometacom, Metacomet. He's known by various different names, who was in the area during King Philip's War or Pometacom's rebellion. Once again, depending on your perspective, that war has different names. You know, that it probably came about from that one defining moment of history. And what it does, the Tungus and all the other tribes, the Connecticut River tribes that were in West Hartford, right, are sometimes now gone, and we talk about Wampanoags instead. And honestly, I don't think Wampanoags want to like to being put in that spot of being the erasure narrative, right? And so it's probably a little bit frustrating on their part to see that happen.
Right. Well, Chris, we are coming up to an hour of you with us. I want to ask you, if we have a few more questions, would you be willing to take a few more questions?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to use this opportunity to. I think that if anyone has a question, I can actually have you do it live. So, which will be a new experience. So you guys are my crash test dummy, so to speak, working with me here. I know that we have some teachers here. I know that James Carter's here, Jean Malloy with Farmington Schools. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask? And I guess we got a shy group here. While I'm waiting for some folks to ask a question, Chris, I'd love to have you come back. There's so many things that you could to talk to us about, other topics that you touched on that maybe we can drill down about. So we would love to have you come back. Here, I have a question here. It's from Jim Carter. Are you allowed to reveal what the next book will be?
Yes, I am. Yeah. I actually have two projects. One of them is untitled, and it's kind of like a earlier reader, very early reader fiction book that I'm creating, which is going to be kind of loosely based on my father's life growing up here in Zibayag. You know, everybody from his generation, when they lived, you know, growing up here, you know, before, especially pre-main Indian land claim settlement, before there was money, all right, you know, people still live subsistence living. You know, they fished, they hunted. My father was included in that lifestyle. And their lives were full. I mean, storytelling at nighttime, you know, nothing but Passamaquoddy, belly laughs all over the place. So they didn't have to have money to be happy. And it wasn't until they left the reservation that and outsiders told them that they were poor, that they actually figured out that, you know, you know, that was the first realization that people looked at them as poor, right? Just because they didn't have money. And so in this, I'm going to talk about, you know, my father, you know, kind of interacting with somebody as a child from off the reservation who assumes that something is missing because of the lack of money, right? And they end up learning about each other and coming to a common understanding of what makes us actually rich as people. What is actually wealth? What's really worth it to us? And that's really our humanity, and that goes way beyond money. And how do we as human beings come to common understanding? The next If You Lived book I'll be writing, and so I got 2 of them coming out, will be If You Lived During the American Revolution. So I'm not going to be, pulling out, anything, the stories of patriots, loyalists, Paul Revere, Declaration of Independence, all of that gets put in there. But you know what also is going to get added? The Treaty of Watertown of 1776. You know why that needs to be included? Because that's the first time the Americans have their sovereignty recognized. It was not recognized first by France, which is oftentimes how the historical books will write it. It was Wabanaki chiefs signing that treaty, who were agreeing to help General Washington in the upcoming revolution. And they include at the end of the treaty the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, which declares that Americans have the right to declare war, trade, and all of those types of things that a sovereign country would be able to do. And so the first recognition of American sovereignty is actually by Wabanaki chiefs in the Treaty of Watertown of 1776, signed the day after the Declaration of Independence was read at the Massachusetts Old State House. And so, including Native, and also other diverse populations, because people of color also included themselves as allies in the American Revolution. Even though on the other end of it, they didn't end up winning out necessarily what they wanted, they still were motivated. Crispus Attucks, right? He's often talked about as the first one to die. He's a person of color. But there's a more complicated history to Crispus Attucks. He was born as a slave. He would escape slavery to the world of living on ships and change his worldview by traveling around the world on ships, and eventually end up back in Massachusetts. And he's also Native on his mother's side. His mother coming from the Natick praying town community. So that mixture, how would somebody, would end up finding themselves at the Boston Massacre, in that encounter when the fighting began, and end up, standing up for the rights of Americans? Well, we need to be inclusive of all of those histories, right? Because America came to be America because of all of that. Natick praying Indians were recruited to fight for the American Revolution. 100 of them did. The Battle of Machias, the Passamaquoddy people protected the entire, what is now the coast of Maine, from invasion by the British, and actually held what George Washington called the northern border, which is now the Canadian border, the St. Croix River, which actually splits my tribe's territory now. And because the Passamaquoddies helped the Americans, the ones on the Canadian side have not been recognized, So all of these things make up how we got to where we are today. And even in that, there's still elements of it that are still honored from these treaties of that past. Mi'kmaq people, who were one of the treaty signers of the Treaty of Watertown, that live in Canada, can join the U.S. military because of the U.S. honoring the Treaty of Watertown, right? And that's built in, because of that treaty. Canadian Mi'kmaq people can come and join the U.S. military at any time, and they don't have to be American citizens to do so. That goes back to that day of the American Revolution. So, being inclusive of all of these different populations and how they all contributed to the effort at getting America's free from, essentially what they felt was the bonds of England, right? Because England was, taxing, doing all kinds of things that, the Americans were not happy with. It's more than just about money and taxes. It's really about, finding a place for yourself. And in that story, there's even kind of a divorce of, there's kind of an effort by Euro-Americans to divorce themselves from their European heritage And you see the creation of in the early stages of America, the creation of fraternal societies like the Improved Order of Red Men and things like that. You know, it was a whites only society, but they would appropriate Native culture in that fraternal society. You know, and that appropriation, you know, by non-Native people carries over into other areas like the Boston Tea Party, right? And other elements of the American Revolution.
Chris, we have a couple more questions. One is the story of Hopkins and Squanto in the book? So that might be one of those questions that might be answered by buying the book, but you want to comment on that?
I'm not sure. Hopkins, is that in reference to Squantum's time as a slave? With one of the missionaries, is that the reference?
You know, I'm going to see if Russ is on the call. Well, they did it through my phone through Gmail, so I don't know if they're here, so I can't find them that way.
I will go into my I do get into Tisquantum's history, and I don't call him Squanto. The English call him Squanto, and Wampanoag people, when they tell the history, call him Tisquantum. So I used that name in the book. I don't go into detail too much about Tisquantum's story, which is very, you know, it's very deep. He was captured as a slave from Pawtuxet, which is where the Mayflower landed. You know, at his village, and ended up in Europe, was bought by missionaries, you know, and given freedom, and was taught English and French and became fluent in both. You know, so if you're wondering how the English and Wampanoag people communicated, there were actually, you know, Tisquantum and Samoset, who had also encountered the English in another way, had both learned some English and actually, you know, approached the English speaking in English. You know, so that's how that happened. Tisquantum, I do mention that when he was returned, he ended up in the hands of Ipanow's people. And he wasn't totally trusted, to tell you the truth. You know, but Ipanow's people out on the Cape were keeping an eye on the ship that had landed in Province, what is now Provincetown, which is out on the Cape, because that's where the Mayflower first landed, and they were chased out by the Nauset people and ended up in Plymouth. So I talk about how Tisquantum was sent by Ipanow, you know, to Usamiquan as you know, as a result of this English ship now sitting in Usamiquan's territory, because he could speak English. And so that's how he ends up with Usamiquan. You know, even though he was previously a Patuxet villager, later on he actually becomes kind of in a way a tool for Usamiquan to be able to communicate. But I will say, from what I hear from Wampanoag people, sometimes in the translation, Tisquantum sometimes did things that benefited himself more than his people. Right, so he can be sometimes a bit of a controversial individual for Wampanoag people to talk about. You know, so I do kind of complicate him a little bit, but the book isn't all about him. You know, he's got a whole other story that a whole book could be written about, just about him alone. You know, and but I do complicate it a little bit.
Because Stanley-Whitman House is in Farmington, the land of the Tunxus, there has been a question here, which is, if you could give me a moment here, do you have any suggestions for resources about the Tunxus? I would have my own answer for that, but I wanted to hear what you might say.
So actually, I would go to your reference as one of the greatest, you know, ones that's coming out recently. But also look into the Brothertown movement. You know, so that piece of history is often not talked about. You know, the Brothertown movement was led by Samson Occam, who was a Mohegan preacher. He was, you know, converted Christian, and he very much believed in the idea of converting Native people to Christianity. He was very much a fire and brimstone type of preacher. In fact, he started a school with Eleazar Wheelock in Connecticut for the purpose of converting Native peoples to Christianity. he saw what was happening with the oversettling and then the encroachment of European settlers as they came into the region. Reservations get created. The Pequot Reservation is 2,500 acres. In 100 years, it's less than 1,000 acres, right? And it's all illegally stolen. So he's saying, okay, there's just too many of these folks, and Native people, we're just not going to make it. We need to move. And he ends up starting a movement that really kind of took about a 30-year movement, but started a migration that some of the Connecticut tribes, including the Tunxus, would join. The Munsee, the Stockbridge Munsee, Delaware, up in Massachusetts as well. They would migrate first to Oneida territory in what is now the state of New York. And the Oneida gave them land and to escape encroachment, basically, and to build a Christianized Native Indian Christian society, basically, farming the way that Europeans wanted, the whole 9 yards. But still, settlers keep coming. They start to encroach on Oneida land. So they migrate again, and they end up in Wisconsin. And today they still exist. The Stockbridge Munsee Mohican community is all the descendants of the people that left during the Brothertown movement. And many of them are Mohican, they're Munsee, they are Mohegan, they are also Tunxus, as well as many of the other tribes that were historically in the state of Connecticut. As their land got encroached on, especially in city areas like Hartford and Farmington and places like that were really being oversettled, their land was basically totally illegally dispossessed from them. They had no land base anymore. And so they saw this migration as really the only way of trying to make a living for themselves and having land so that they could survive. So talking about the Brothertown movement is going to lift up and bring in the stories of the Tunxus and other tribes that were historically in the area, how their land was illegally dispossessed, which your resource talks about very well, how that process happened and what motivated them to eventually leave the area.
So what I'm going to do is just a quick time check because we will be wrapping things up. I wanted to just remind folks, there's a question here wondering if you could repeat the name of the website again for the indie bookstores. And if you could just quickly, your recommendation is to go to your mom and pop bookstores and order it, right?
Yeah. So the larger website is Indie Bound, INDIE Bound, Indie Bound. And then you do a search for the book there, and it'll bring up local stores to you based on your location.
And then there's a real quick, my dad took me to burial sites in Connecticut in the 1970s, and I recall a search for Native Americans. Are any tribes buried in colonial cemeteries? And before you say anything, I can just tell you that we're doing research now on our cemeteries, Memento Mori, for example, and we have evidence of some individuals identified as Indian or Tunxus, but we have a burial ground in Tunxus, in Farmington, for the most part. But do you want to speak to that? And I can reread it for you. They want to know if there are any tribes buried in colonial cemeteries.
Yeah, I mean, as a practice, you wouldn't see it necessarily, because in colonial days, they were already, especially Connecticut. Connecticut began the reservation idea. So the idea of separating populations of Euro-Americans and Native people began in the 1600s. And so in many towns, there were no Native people living there unless they became a landowner and had kind of fully taken on Christianity. And so it's not impossible to find a Native person in a colonial cemetery. Absolutely not. It's just the tendency is that Native people were encompassed on a reservation. They have their own cemetery, like the Pequot Reservation has its own modern day cemetery, which includes a historical burial ground on one side. So there's a Christian burial ground from the time when they converted, and there's also a pre-Christian burial ground in that cemetery that's on the reservation. And that reservation was established in 1666. I mean, so they have such a long history on that particular piece of land that they have all of that. But if you go into a colonial town, you're going to find basically white Christian landowners and their wives and daughters, basically as the people that make up those cemeteries. Occasionally, you will find a slave buried there if their owner wanted them buried with them, and so that you'll find those on occasion, but the tendency is that if you look at colonial cemeteries, that it's mostly filled with white Christian landowners and their family members.
That's right. Chris, I want to thank you so much for doing this with us tonight, being our Conversation Club speaker for this evening. And what I have a really great comment here. This is from Pamela Cooley. Your passion for your subject is inspirational. I give thanks to you for telling the true story. And I think that's a good way for us to sign off for the evening. And again, I thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone who joined the Zoom webinar, and I'll get better and better at this as we go along. And I do want to extend an invitation for you to come back again.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thank you so much for having me. And thank you everybody for joining. For those of you that have bought the book, I really appreciate you. Those of you looking to buy the book, and hopefully you can find a copy. Once again, Amazon does have copies, but IndieBound will hopefully find you a local bookstore that has it. Definitely, I hope you enjoy the book. I hope there's something that you can learn from it. I did write it not just for 2nd to 4th graders, but honestly with teachers as an audience as well, so hopefully teachers can find a way to teach the Thanksgiving holiday in a culturally competent manner, which is once again what Agamot was born to do, is really, how to help educators in engaging with this content.
Thank you, Christopher Newell, and wish you a good Thanksgiving and a good night. And thank you everyone for being on the Zoom webinar.
All right, thank you so much.